Hey there, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.
I still remember the way he leaned against the kitchen counter that afternoon, like he had just done me the world's biggest favor by borrowing my laptop without asking. He held a cup of coffee in one hand, the other casually stuffed in his hoodie pocket, and looked at me with that familiar smirk I'd grown up seeing. The one that always meant trouble was already done and dusted, and he wasn't sorry one bit. "Don't worry," he said, almost chuckling. "You're not that important anyway." That was Derek in a nutshell. My little brother by 2 years, but somehow always treated like the golden boy of the family, the one who walked into rooms and turned heads, who could fail upwards so smoothly you'd think gravity didn't apply to him. I'd been gone for less than a day, just a short overnight trip to help a friend move across state lines, and when I came back, I found my laptop sitting open on the coffee table, logged out, screen blank, charger unplugged. The way someone would leave it if they didn't want to admit they'd been using it. I knew immediately. Derek had asked the night before if he could borrow it for a quick thing, and I told him no. Not because I'm mean or stingy, but because that laptop held everything I'd built for the last 5 years. My work files, client projects, my personal portfolio, the digital backbone of my career. I was a freelance data analyst, had been for nearly a decade, slowly grinding my way out of contract limbo and into more serious opportunities. I didn't have a fancy office or a team backing me up. I had that laptop. That was it. So when I opened it and saw a fresh user profile, my heart started racing. It took only a few clicks to realize what had happened. My files were gone, not hidden, erased. Entire folders, directories, system settings, like someone had wiped it down to resell it on Craigslist. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he made a backup. Maybe he didn't know what he was doing. But then I looked at the date stamps and realized it wasn't ignorance. He'd factory reset the damn thing, reinstalled a new OS, and logged in with his email. I walked into the kitchen, clutching the lifeless machine in both hands, and asked him, as calmly as I could, "What did you do?" That's when he gave me the line that would be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. He didn't even look up from his coffee, just said it. "You're not that important anyway." He laughed a little afterward, like it was a joke. Like what he'd done didn't matter because I didn't matter. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the laptop or break down into tears. I just stood there, feeling the heat rise up in my face and pulse behind my eyes, and I turned around without another word. There's something about that kind of betrayal, the quiet, smirking kind, that sinks deeper than any loud argument, because it tells you, in no uncertain terms, that someone close to you sees your life as background noise, something they can hit mute on whenever they feel like it. Our parents, of course, brushed it off. They said he probably didn't know what he was doing, that I should have backed everything up, that he didn't mean any harm. My mom even said, "You know how boys are, honey. He's always been a little careless." I wanted to scream. Derek was 29, not 19. He had a tech job himself, worked in IT for a mid-sized company in downtown Dallas. He knew damn well what he was doing when he wiped that hard drive. But I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain the hours, weeks, months of work I'd just lost. I didn't tell them how many clients I'd now have to apologize to, how many gigs I'd likely lose. I just nodded like a good daughter and went back upstairs to my room. I remember closing the door and locking it behind me, something I hadn't done in years, and sitting on the bed, my breath shallow, hands shaking. I had the laptop in front of me, powerless and cold. But what Derek didn't know, what he never cared to ask, was that I still had an old external drive buried in my closet. A backup from 6 months ago. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Enough to start over if I played it right. I plugged it in and waited, the soft hum of the hard drive kicking up like a heartbeat in the silence. As I watched the first few folders appear on the screen, I felt something shift inside me. Not just rage, not just the dull ache of humiliation, but something sharper, cooler, the kind of clarity that only comes when you've been pushed past a line you didn't know you had. Derek had always gotten away with everything. Late-night parties in high school, Failing classes in college, cheating on ex-girlfriends, crashing my car once and blaming me for parking it in the wrong spot. And every single time, someone made excuses for him. But this time, he'd erased more than my work. He'd erased the last excuse I'd ever make for him. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to stay quiet this time. I wasn't going to fight fire with fire. I was going to let him burn himself down, and when the ashes settled, I'd be the one holding the matchbox. Clean, calm, untouchable. And so I stayed up late that night, restoring what I could, piece by piece. While in the background, Derek blasted music from his room, texting his friends about some new company he was excited to apply for, saying it was his shot to go big. He said the team there was cutting edge, that they were building something huge, and that he had an inside track. He didn't know that I'd already applied there 2 weeks earlier. He didn't know that my interview was scheduled for the very next morning, and he sure as hell didn't know who they were really looking to hire. But he would, soon. People expect that when someone crosses a line that deep, when someone you share blood with takes a hammer to everything you've built with years of sweat and late nights, the natural thing is to explode, to scream, to slam doors, to call out every injustice in one furious eruption. But I didn't explode. I didn't even raise my voice. That was the first time in my life I understood what it meant to go quiet, not because you're weak, but because you're finally, absolutely done. I sat there in my room, in the dim blue glow of my monitor, files crawling their way back from a 6-month-old backup. And I thought not about revenge, not in the usual way, not in the movies and fire kind of way, but about reinvention. Because something in me clicked that night, something that had been sleeping for far too long. And it was this realization that I didn't have to win by crushing him. I just had to outlive the version of myself that ever needed to be seen by him at all. The next few days blurred into one another like brushstrokes on a fast-drying canvas. I moved mechanically, like a woman possessed, but not frantic. There was a calm in the chaos, like a surgeon at work, precise, focused, unsentimental. I went through every piece of the backup drive, reassembled my portfolio, recreated analytics reports from scratch, even rebuilt a predictive model I'd been designing for a retail client. And all this while, Derek strutted around the house with his usual careless confidence, tossing keys onto the hallway table, taking long calls on speakerphone about new opportunities, never once acknowledging what he had done, never even asking how I was managing. He was in his own world, and that suited me just fine. There was one morning, maybe 4 or 5 days after the laptop incident, when I overheard him bragging to one of his friends on the phone. The call was loud enough to reach across the hall through both of our closed doors. "Dude, this company's next level," he said, his voice thick with excitement, the way it always was when he smelled money or prestige. "They're growing like crazy, about to double their team. I'm basically a lock for the role. I mean, my resume is sick." I didn't know the name of the company yet. Not until later that afternoon, when I opened my email and saw the subject line, "Final Interview, Fusion Core Analytics." I remember leaning back in my chair and letting out this short, sharp laugh that startled even me. The kind of laugh you don't plan, one that just escapes because the irony is too thick to hold inside. Fusion Core had reached out to me after I'd submitted a cold application through a recruiter's LinkedIn post. They were looking for someone with a hybrid background. Technical skill with data, yes, but also leadership capability, the ability to guide a team during rapid growth. My resume stood out apparently. So did the case study I'd submitted, one I built entirely from scratch during a 3-day caffeine-fueled sprint that ended at 4 in the morning. And now they wanted me back for the final interview. Not for an entry-level spot like Derek was gunning for, but for a senior role, one that reported directly to the VP of strategy. It was almost too poetic. And yet I said nothing. I didn't tell Derek. I didn't mention the company's name or drop any casual hints. I didn't change my routine or schedule interviews loudly in the living room where he might overhear. Instead, I worked from behind the curtain as I always had, quietly polishing my presentation, rehearsing responses to behavioral questions, and crafting a vision for team growth that I knew would hit exactly the notes Fusion Core wanted to hear. Meanwhile, he kept talking. He talked over dinner. He talked during football games. He even talked during one of Mom's long rants about getting a real job, saying, "Just wait, Ma, I'm about to land something serious." And all the while, I just nodded along, playing the part of the sister whose biggest concern was figuring out how to recover lost files, not the one who was about to leapfrog him on the very path he thought he was clearing for himself. There was a moment 2 nights before my final interview when I almost broke. We were both in the kitchen late at night. He'd come in for a snack and I was pouring tea. And out of nowhere he said, "Hey, I meant to ask, did you ever get your files back?" I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in a week, and saw not just the smugness, but the complete lack of awareness, like he thought his careless little stunt had already faded into the rear view. And I just smiled, holding the cup in both hands to steady the heat rising in my chest, and said, "Some of it, yeah, enough to move forward." He nodded like that was enough for him, like the damage had been minimal and the story was over. He took his chips and left. But I stood there for a while longer, my tea cooling in my hands, thinking about how many years I'd spent in that house, waiting for someone to notice how hard I worked, how much I carried. And now, finally, I realized it didn't matter whether they saw it. Not Mom, not Derek, not anyone. Because what was coming didn't need their approval. It just needed to happen. And so, with the kind of quiet determination that doesn't ask for applause, I printed out my final slide deck, polished my summary pitch one last time, and closed my eyes that night knowing something was about to shift forever. Derek thought he was on the cusp of something big, a new job, a step up, maybe even the start of a career he could brag about. But what he didn't realize was that he wasn't climbing alone. He didn't know that someone else was already on the ladder ahead of him, moving faster, smarter, and with a hell of a lot more to prove. And this time, I wasn't going to make room. There's something surreal about watching a person walk into a trap they don't even know exists, especially when they helped build it themselves, piece by thoughtless piece. And when the door finally clicks shut, they don't even recognize the sound of it locking. That was exactly how it felt on the morning of my first day at Fusion Core, standing just outside the glass-walled conference room, palms slightly damp, pulse steady but fast, watching the silhouettes of my new team shift and settle into seats through the frosted edge of the door. I hadn't slept much the night before, not because I was nervous about the job, though maybe a small part of me still felt that creeping sense of fraudulence that anyone who's ever pivoted mid-career knows intimately, but because my brain couldn't quite wrap itself around the absurdity of it all. Not just that I had landed the position, not just that I had secured the exact role Derek had been dreaming about for weeks, but that when I walked into that room, I wouldn't be a junior associate. I wouldn't be an analyst. I would be the boss. The irony had marinated for days since the offer letter came through. Salary, benefits, company credit card, the works. But it hadn't truly hit me until that moment, until the recruiting coordinator smiled and said, "They're all in there, just waiting on you." And I reached for the door handle knowing that once I opened it, nothing between me and Derek would ever be the same again. I hadn't told him, not a word. He still thought I was wallowing over my lost files, maybe applying for a few gigs here and there, maybe trying to scrape together a few freelance clients to cover rent. He had no clue that I had already passed all 3 interview rounds before he'd even updated his resume, or that while he'd been bragging about how the company was perfect for his skill set, I'd been planning how I was going to lead the very department he thought he was walking into. The door opened smoothly, the hum of conversation paused for just a second as heads turned, and I stepped inside with that practiced calmness I had spent my entire adult life perfecting. The kind that makes people underestimate you right before you prove them all wrong. The first few faces were unfamiliar, polite smiles, a few nods, and then there he was, sitting at the far end of the table, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place already. Derek turned slowly toward me with the same cocky half-smile he used when he was lying about who really broke the garage window when we were kids or who accidentally deleted all my music off the family computer. but then his eyes locked onto mine, and I watched that smile falter just slightly as confusion crept in around the edges. He blinked. Once, twice, probably thinking this was some weird coincidence, some mix-up. Maybe I was consulting, maybe I was shadowing someone. But then the director of HR stood up and said, "Everyone, this is Rachel Becker. She's our new senior strategy lead for data operations. She'll be overseeing most of this division's workflow starting today, so please give her a warm welcome." The pause in the room was barely noticeable. Maybe 2 or 3 seconds, but in my mind, it stretched into a slow-motion panorama of Derek's ego crumbling, one layer at a time, until all that was left was a stunned silence wrapped in that too-late realization. He was not just meeting a new coworker. He was meeting his new boss. He opened his mouth. I saw the beginning of whatever comeback he was about to fumble through. But nothing came out. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes wide now, trying to read something in my face that might tell him this wasn't happening, that it was a mistake or a prank or some administrative confusion. But I gave him nothing, just a small professional smile and a slight nod, then turned to the others and began introducing myself with the calm, clipped authority I had spent hours practicing in front of the mirror. I told them about my background, my data work, the leadership model I believed in, and how I wanted our team to operate like a well-oiled machine that understood not just numbers, but the human stories behind them. Derek didn't say a word during the whole meeting. He sat there stone-faced, while I outlined the roadmap for the next quarter, fielded a few soft questions, and wrapped up with a reminder about our first team sync later that week. By the time I finished, I saw him looking down at the notebook he hadn't written a single thing in. His pen lay untouched beside it. After the meeting, as the others filtered out, a few offering kind greetings or quick comments about projects, he lingered behind. He didn't come up to me right away, just sort of hovered, waiting for the others to clear out, like he needed an empty room to say what was brewing behind those twitching eyebrows. When he finally did speak, it was almost a whisper. "What are you doing here?" Not rude, not aggressive, just stunned. And for a brief moment, I almost felt bad. Almost. I looked at him, meeting his eyes without a trace of gloating, and said, "Working like everyone else here." And then I turned and walked past him, leaving him standing there in the conference room that, for a few glorious minutes, had felt like his audition stage, only to realize someone else had already been handed the script. He didn't follow me. He didn't say another word. That evening, when I got home, he was already there. He didn't greet me, didn't ask questions, just sat on the couch with the TV on, volume too loud, pretending like he hadn't just had the air knocked out of him. And I didn't poke at him. I didn't gloat. I simply grabbed a glass of water, checked my phone, and reminded him, casually, almost like I was talking to a stranger, that our next meeting was Friday morning, and I expected everyone to bring ideas. He didn't look at me, but I saw the way his jaw clenched, the way he gripped the remote a little too tightly. He had finally realized something that had taken me a lifetime to learn, that the quiet ones aren't always the weakest. Sometimes they're just waiting for the perfect moment to speak. In the days that followed our first encounter as colleagues rather than siblings, the dynamic between Derek and me began to shift in ways that were almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, like the slow, silent erosion of a cliff's edge, barely noticeable in the moment, but undeniably catastrophic once the cracks reached the foundation. He tried, at first, to pretend that nothing had changed, clinging to the false bravado that had served him so well for years, cracking jokes a bit too loudly in team chats, offering opinions in meetings that carried more heat than substance, and acting like he was still in control of the narrative. But he wasn't. Not anymore. The stage was no longer his, and for the first time in his life, Derek wasn't the favored son, the golden boy, or even the loudest voice in the room. He was just another employee. And I was the one holding the pen that would write his evaluations. At first, I was careful, almost overly so, to treat him with the same level of professionalism and fairness I extended to every other team member. avoiding even the faintest whiff of personal bias or retribution. I didn't speak to him outside of work-related matters, didn't reference our shared past, and certainly didn't acknowledge the awkward tension that now hung in every room we occupied together. But Derek, being who he was, couldn't resist the urge to test the boundaries, to try and assert some form of dominance, even if only through passive resistance. He interrupted me once during a presentation, undercutting a strategy I'd outlined in front of our VP with a smug, "I think we've tried that before and it didn't work." He did it with a smile, of course, as though it were just harmless input, but I knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to chip away at my authority, to remind everyone, or perhaps just himself, that I wasn't untouchable. But he underestimated me, as he always had, because while he was busy posturing and performing, I was listening, I was observing, I was collecting data the way I always had, quietly, efficiently, without fanfare. I started noticing patterns. Tasks left incomplete, emails unanswered, reports turned in late or riddled with half-baked numbers that didn't align with our internal data. His work wasn't bad, not exactly, but it lacked depth, lacked the kind of thoroughness that serious roles required, and I began to see the cracks that had always been there. Only now they were no longer hidden by charm or excuses. Derek had always been able to coast on just enough effort to get by, but Fusion Core was not the kind of place that rewarded that kind of shallow competence, and I, now in the position I was in, wasn't about to let it slide. There was one afternoon in particular that crystallized everything for me, the moment I knew, beyond any hesitation, that this game we were playing was no longer just about old wounds or sibling rivalry. It was about merit, about respect. We were preparing a quarterly forecast for the executive board, something that required meticulous analysis and flawless projections. I had assigned each team member a section of the data set, with Derek responsible for compiling key performance indicators for our logistics stream. A straightforward task for someone with his background. Or so I thought. When he submitted his portion, I reviewed it late at night in the quiet of my office, the hum of the city outside my window, and what I found was a mess. Incomplete fields, outdated metrics, graphs that didn't match the source data, and conclusions that made no logical sense. It was the kind of careless work I might have expected from an intern during their first week, not from someone who claimed to be an industry veteran. I sat there staring at his file, feeling that old mix of disappointment and fury rise in my chest. But it was no longer the kind of emotion that clouded judgment. It was clean, cold, resolute. I documented everything. I rewrote the section myself, sent the revised report to the board with my annotations, and then I requested a private one-on-one with Derek for the following morning. He showed up 10 minutes late, coffee in hand, eyes bleary from a night out, still clinging to the illusion that his charm could smooth over the gaps. He greeted me with that same casual, lopsided grin and said, "Rach, come on, now you know I had a crazy week. Just needed a little extra time." I didn't smile, I didn't nod. I simply slid a printed copy of his submission across the table and said, "We need to talk about expectations." What followed wasn't a screaming match, nor was it some dramatic confrontation. It was a clear, measured performance review. I walked him through every error, every lapse in quality, every missed deadline over the past 6 weeks. I showed him the objective metrics we used to evaluate progress, the peer feedback that had raised concerns, and the comparative data that placed him at the bottom third of the team. I told him, in the same tone I'd use with anyone else, that unless his performance improved significantly over the next 30 days, we'd have to place him on a formal improvement plan. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized this wasn't personal. It was structural. He didn't argue. He didn't throw a fit or storm out. He just sat there, stunned, finally understanding what it meant to be held accountable, not as a brother, not as a favored son, but as a professional in a world that didn't care about family histories or childhood dynamics. And as he left my office, shoulders slightly slumped, walking slower than usual, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but something more profound and far more dangerous. Closure. The kind that doesn't come with loud victories or applause, but with quiet control over a situation that once made you feel powerless. At home, things were colder than ever. We spoke only in passing, if at all, and even then, only when necessity forced it. My mother called one evening, asking how the new job was going, and when I mentioned casually that Derek and I were working together now, she laughed nervously and said, "Well, I'm sure he'll help you settle in." I didn't correct her. I didn't say a word. Some illusions, I realized, are best left untouched. They serve a purpose after all. But deep down, I knew the truth, and so did he. The roles had reversed, and the long game I had played, with patience, with precision, without ever raising my voice, was finally bearing fruit. And this time, there would be no going back. It's a strange sensation the moment when the scale finally tips. Not because you forced it with fury or violence or some theatrical declaration of vengeance, but because reality itself, with all its weight and logic, simply catches up to the people who've been outrunning it for too long. That's what it felt like the day the final reorganization announcement came down from corporate. There was no dramatic confrontation, no fireworks, no last-minute bargaining, just an email from upper management outlining the upcoming changes across departments, one of which included the quiet but decisive elimination of Derek's role, not because of me, not explicitly, and yet I knew, and he knew, that everything that had happened led him exactly to that edge. It wasn't even me who initiated the reorg. The higher-ups had been planning it for weeks, citing budget efficiency and streamlining of overlapping responsibilities. And Derek, as it turned out, had landed squarely in a part of the structure that no longer made sense. But what made it complicated, what made it taste different in my mouth, was that I had been in every single planning meeting where those changes were discussed, every strategy session where names were floated, every debate over which positions could be absorbed into other teams. I could have stepped in. I could have flagged his position, argued its value, made a case for retention, but I didn't. I sat through those meetings with my notes in front of me, my face neutral, and my mouth closed, not because I was angry anymore. That storm had passed, but because I finally understood something about power that I'd never grasped before. True power isn't loud, it isn't messy, it isn't some explosive declaration of superiority. It's the quiet refusal to save someone from the consequences they've spent their whole life outrunning, especially when you know, deep in your bones, that had the roles been reversed, they would never have done the same for you. When Derek got the email, I wasn't in the office. I was working remotely that day, ironically enough, reviewing new applications for a junior analyst role, the very kind of position he had once dismissed as entry-level nonsense. I didn't see his reaction, but I didn't need to. I heard about it from a colleague later, someone who didn't know we were siblings, who said he'd gone pale, closed his laptop midday, and walked out without saying a word. No grand exit, no accusations, just silence, the sound of someone finally realizing that the ground beneath them wasn't solid anymore. That evening, back at home, the house was still. He didn't speak to me at first. I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table in the same hoodie he'd worn during his cockiest days. But it hung differently now, looser somehow, like it no longer fit the man who had once strutted through life like it owed him success just for showing up. When he finally looked at me, his face was unreadable, not angry, not pleading, just confused, like he still hadn't fully processed the way the story had turned. "I got the notice," he said flatly, the way someone might comment on the weather or an unexpected car repair. I didn't nod. I didn't look away. I waited, and then he said, "Did you know?" There it was, the question he couldn't ask before, the one that had been crawling under his skin for weeks. Ever since that first day I walked into the conference room and shattered the version of reality he'd been so sure of. Did I know? Of course I did. But what he really wanted to know wasn't whether I'd seen the email before he did. It was whether I'd let it happen. Whether I'd stood by while his fate was sealed. And if so, why? I took a long breath, Not because I was unsure of the answer, but because some truths deserve a pause, deserve weight. I didn't push for it, I said quietly, but I didn't stop it either. His jaw clenched slightly, the only sign of emotion breaking through the surface, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then, almost bitterly, he muttered, "So this is payback, for the laptop, for everything." And for the first time, I let myself speak honestly, not as his boss, not as a colleague, but as the sister he had pushed aside too many times, the woman he had belittled, underestimated, and erased. "No," I said, "this is life. This is what it looks like when the world stops cushioning you from your own behavior." He stood slowly, walked to the sink, and rinsed out his cup, a motion so mundane it felt surreal, given the conversation we were having. But when he turned back around, there was something raw in his eyes, something I hadn't seen since we were kids. Not guilt exactly, but recognition, acknowledgement, like he finally saw me. Not the shadow, not the background character in his story, but a person with her own arc, her own fire, her own path. He didn't apologize, not then, maybe not ever. But as he walked past me, toward the hallway, he paused, and in a voice just above a whisper, he said, "You really were better at this than me, weren't you?" It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't even regret. It was a truth, raw and unfiltered, a final breath of honesty from someone who had spent too long pretending he was always the smartest person in the room. And I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Some victories don't require celebration. Some endings don't need punctuation. And so the story settled, not with a bang, not with revenge shouted from rooftops, but with a quiet knowing that he had erased everything I had once, years of my work, my effort, my identity. And I hadn't erased him in return. I hadn't fired him. I hadn't humiliated him. I'd simply let him meet the very wall he'd been speeding toward for years. And when he hit it, I didn't catch him. I just watched. Whether I went too far, whether I should have helped, whether some part of me still wanted to be the bigger person, I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. That's the thing about endings. They never really answer the questions you think they will. They just close the door. And sometimes, that's enough.